Okay, our next session is the Poetry of Advocacy, a spoken word performance and fireside chat by Medgine Matherin. And so the first portion of this talk is going to be a couple of pieces that Medgine has put together. And then afterwards, she's going to discuss some of her experiences. We're going to have some discussions and some interaction from the audience, so feel free. We'll make sure that both Edmonton and London have a chance to respond when we get to that portion. So Ashka, if you make sure that we have a mic or someone who, if they want to speak, that's available. So in this session, Medgine's going to talk about having spent 10 years navigating chronic illnesses such as lupus, CIDP, polymyositis, Raynaud's, many of which constitute as rare diseases and affect predominantly women of color. Medgine knows what it's like to navigate the health maze in isolation. This session will showcase spoken word performances about her diagnosis, followed by a fireside chat about the ways in which poetry can help in developing the language to advocate for yourself. So to introduce Medgine, she is an award-winning Haitian-born spoken word artist and patient advocate. Her multilingual upbringing not only prompted her to begin experimenting with the potential and magic of language, but naturally compelled her into a deep love of poetry. She currently serves as a mentor with the 2020 Horizon Circles Writers Program and patient advisor with the Health Quality Council of Alberta.
Sweet. Thank you, Manisha. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Perfect. I know I don't look sick, but there's a riot beneath my skin and I'm having trouble articulating its treason. If you ask me what it's like having lupus and other chronic illnesses, I tell you of the wolves roaming through muscles and joints, known to prey on kidneys and other vital organs. The sound of their howl echo my limbs most mornings as I lay awake, leaking exhaustion between breaths, standing at a cliff of self-pity. The aggressive shores of my sorrows become arms my feet often find opened to welcome. I tell you that I utter the same pain for so long that I worry that those closest to me can translate my redundancies for their irritation. So I dilute my outward expression to make them worry less about me, in an attempt to seep more courage in them than I have the strength for, because I might need to borrow theirs when pain renders me desperate. In this battle of invisible illness, pride is a lieutenant, painting a tearless demeanor as camouflage and straightening spine as a regular army drill, and I subjected myself under its rank, convinced that it is how I will win this war. But if you ask me, how's it working so far? I tell you, I don't know. My limbs crumble from time to time. Terror and confusion throb my throat like a lump I'm afraid to touch. How do you love a body accustomed to playing riddles? How do you answer a body who makes a mockery of the Jesus you were taught that heals, a body who can be too loud for me to remember God's mercies in the morning? I know what it's like to taste the cup of expired patience, to become so accustomed to its bitterness that joy becomes a distant lover. I have tried to ask a caterpillar to give me her persistence in remaining in this old flesh, for my body is no strong chrysalis to shield me from the fragments of a frail body desperate for healing. But my pastor once advised me never to help a caterpillar struggling out of her cocoon. To help her out of this crucible is to cripple her ability to fly. And that's when I realized that God's silence did not negate the potency of his mercy towards me. My God is not estranged to the vocabulary of my weeping, so when joy greets me, I will laugh and avoid calling myself a liar. and I will weep as necessary, because to stifle my lamentation is to betray the cleansing that is necessary for my joy to one day bloom. This pain tolerance is my becoming. The unraveling of praying hands, the unfolding of an answer that I'm still learning to sit with. Thank you. So this particular poem that I just shared is obviously the story of of words, years of trying to process what it means to have lupus. And so I was diagnosed back in 2012 as I was working my 9 to 5, and it's been a journey since then. And for those of you who don't know, when it comes to lupus, because it's an autoimmune condition that affects a lot of connective tissue, it can give way to other chronic illnesses. And so for me, that's what happened. And so my next poem talks about a subsequent diagnosis that came from after a few years of navigating lupus. And it's called Crawl. I never thought I'd ever tell my doctor, I think my spine is on fire. When he asks me calmly, describe your symptoms, I tell him, I went for a pedicure and the water I plunged my feet into felt like lava. I tell him, doctor, I am 3 years into a body where my immune cell's favorite game is Russian roulette. I know what to do when the bullet hits the joints and muscles, but this is a different kind of blaze. I don't think this is lupus. Hey, doctor, can you find my kind of body in your big book of diagnosis? Do you have a solution? He asks me, do you feel the pain now? I tell him no. The game starts when I'm asleep. He gives me nothing for the nightmare, then tells me to come back if it persists. 1 month later, the fire quietly dies on its own, but the sandstorm begins. Pick, 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 hands, feet, pick, 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 pins and needles, pick, 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 pins and needles, pick, pick, pick. I place my hand on cheeks and stomach, searching for the softest parts of my body. Why does everything I touch feel like sandpaper? Why can't I feel the soles of my feet anymore? I keep getting asked if my pain is dull, sharp, or achy, and I don't know what to say. Pain has a way of making language slippery when softness and feeling turn into ghosts and memories, and the body you once fought to make home becomes another stranger. It's all of the above, and then some. If you ever find yourself in the same haunted place, when limbs become a little less tendon and more wire, a little less flesh and more lead, a little less muscle and more numb, inhale. And let every new breath bless your porous persistence to live. And by some miracle, you have survived. And somewhere in your weary body lies a debris of courage, a grace that has kept you here. And sometimes a victory begins as a slow crawl, a gathering of limbs, dragging forward 1 inch at a time, all the way into a new day. Thank you. And this is about my diagnosis with CIDP, which is chronic inflammatory demyelinated polyneuropathy, which is a Scrabble word essentially. For it's the chronic form of GBS, Guillain-Barré syndrome. And so the symptoms are essentially, it was when, because of lupus, my immune system started affecting the nerves in my, the coating around my nerves, specifically in the peripheries of my hands, so my hands and feet. And so for about 3 months, I experienced, initially it was just, it literally felt like fire around my spine. And I remember that interaction with my family doctor where, you know, at that point, obviously I had a specialist, but of course with specialists, you have limited access to them. So I wasn't able to see my rheumatologist, and I went straight to my family doctor, and I said these words, and I remember his face. I remember him just staring at me, not really knowing how to answer, but the best words that I could explain how I was feeling was that it just feels really hot. For whatever reason, I would wake up in the middle of the night around 3 o'clock with this agonizing, like, it just felt like my spine was on fire. And he didn't really know how to respond to what I shared. And so with all of the years I've navigated my own chronic illness, so I have about over a decade worth of lived experience, but I've also worked with family physicians as a practice facilitator. So I have a little bit of a background working with different healthcare providers when it comes to quality improvement work, which has been an interesting journey to navigate, both as a person with lived experience, but also even just as a lover of words and not really knowing how to find my words to communicate with both my care providers and the people around me. And so it's been a long journey of learning how to find my words, to share my story, but also to reclaim it. And so that's the reason why I wanted to talk a little bit more today about these things. And so maybe we could start with with all the things. I wanted to first start with just by sharing a quote from Audre Lorde. There was an essay that she wrote around poetry being not a luxury that I just feel like sets the stage for what I want to share. And so I'm just going to read it. When we view living in the European mode only as a problem to be solved, we then rely solely upon our ideas to make us free. For these were what the white fathers told us were precious. But as we become more in touch with our own ancient, Black, non-European view of living as a situation to be experienced and interacted with, we learn more and more to cherish our feelings and to respect those hidden sources of our power, from where true knowledge and therefore lasting actions come. At this point in time, I believe that women carry within ourselves the possibility for fusion of these two approaches as keystones for survival, and we come closest to this combination in our poetry. I speak here as poetry as a revelation or distillation of experience, not the sterile wordplay that too often the white fathers distorted the word poetry to mean, in order to cover their desperate wish for imagination without insight. For women, then, poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity for our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change. First made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. Poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. The farthest external horizons of our hopes and fears are cobbled by our poems, carved from the rock experiences of our daily lives. And so I wanted to share this in particular, and it really resonated as I was reflecting on my reasons for being here, because so often in my own journey in my own poetry, it really became for me as a way of reclaiming my power, and bringing light to something that was difficult. And so I just have a post question that I wanted to actually ask everyone. Raise your hands if you've ever experienced medical gaslighting. Keep your hands up if you identify as a woman or non-binary. And I'm so glad that this engagement, this feels good. There was a study, and obviously the results are reflective. There's so many of you guys put your hands up and kept your hand up. You know, it's really well known that women have endured for centuries, including delays in diagnosis, treatment, emotional support for serious health issues. There was a study that was done at Journal Health Communication that reflected those same facts. And I just wanted to maybe just start from there, because I think when it comes to poetry, we typically come with our own impression of what it is, and it typically gets reduced to the arts and never gets introduced to any other mediums other than a form of entertainment or leisure. And so I felt like the Audre Lorde quote really set the stage as a way that, you know, to highlight the fact that this is coming from lived experience. This is a way to reclaim words, but also naming the pains in a way that that is not formulaic, in the same way that medicine often becomes or is. And so, yeah. Yeah, for me, for when it comes to having lupus, it took about 6 months back in 2012. So it was about 6 months of navigating joint pain, chronic pain really, and back-to-back appointments with family doctors and test after test, blood work after blood work, before I finally got a referral to see a rheumatologist, which then resulted on either I had rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, and then the diagnosis was lupus. When it comes to CIDP, because it was 3 years into already having lupus, and I learned a lot about how to advocate for myself by that point, I think that really helped get myself into an earlier diagnosis. But even within that, it took a lot of ER visits, because there were a lot of issues that family doctors did not have unfortunately the skills, or I don't even know, but they weren't equipped to help me. And all they asked was the best thing you could do is go to the ER. And the challenge with especially rare diseases, and as well as symptoms that come and go, is that what would happen to me specifically when it comes to CIDP is I would go to the ER, and basically my symptoms would be there during the time, but the wait time would be hours. And so those symptoms would then be less and less. And by the time, I remember a specific time where it was like, I waited basically 3 hours before seeing an actual doctor. And by that point, the pain was it just went down. And so they did all the testing, and I was already kind of like, well, this was like, it was a lot more prominent 2 hours ago, but no one was here. And so I ended up driving myself home. And as I'm driving home, the pain comes back. So then what do? Do you go back and wait an extra 3 hours for the same thing? And it became this loop. And I know that I'm not the only one who's experienced that nuance when, you know, like when you don't really get the care that you need at the time that you need it. And oftentimes when you get home, it's the mental toll of experiencing a lot of that pain. You're left by yourself to cope with that. And I think for me, in the years that I've experienced all these different things, I found a lot of comfort in poetry, in the sense that I was able to find someone else who had language to how I was feeling, and it made things a little less isolating mentally, you know, but physically, obviously, it still goes down to, you know, the way that care is being administered in our time. Yeah. I think several things. I think a lot of people don't know about these different illnesses. I didn't know about CIDP until I got diagnosed with CIDP. I knew vaguely about lupus when I was told that I might have it. And so I think sometimes it can be challenging, especially when diseases like this get referred to as rare diseases. I think it automatically puts less emphasis on the prominence of diseases like that, which kind of keeps it at the margin. And oftentimes it's under-resourced and underfunded, and it goes to this endless cycle where, you know, if resources and if resources and manpower is not being invested in these different conditions, it remains at the margins, and it will not get, you know, as much of a highlight, like say like diabetes or breast cancer. And so a lot of it has to do with equity, you know, and these diseases do often affect marginalized communities. And so it's a lot of system work, I think. Yeah. You know, cried a lot. I had family to help, but I think when you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with an undiagnosed symptoms, it's like a specific kind of agony where you go to doctors and doctors don't know what's going on. And so you go to, you know, what is supposed to be a group of experts to help you find an answer, but if they don't know, you're left with these questions, and you don't really know where to turn. And so I was able to, it took me a while for, even when it comes to, for example, like my first poem that I shared about lupus, it took me about 6 years to write. And by that, it was just more like, you know, a lot of it was written on my bedside, navigating a lot of fatigue, not being able to do a lot, or being on sick leave. And it was just me and my feelings in my bed, trying to process, trying to find a way to be more, to find a way to improve my mental health, because it was just a lot of grieving my old life and grieving what is the loss of what I thought my life would be. And in the midst of my own journaling practice came some of these lines that came from the poem. And it took me a while for me to go back into the archives of these moments and to gather those, and then to find a way to put them together. Because that's how that's how the poem came to be. It was years of moments, really, stitched together into what it is, because it was written in those flares, in those experiences. Yeah. I mean, I've had doctors say there's nothing that we can do, several times. And at the beginning, I would take their word. You know, especially at the beginning, when you in the early stages of advocating for yourself, you don't even know what that means. You just go to the doctor like everybody tells you to. And so, so at the beginning, it was like, well, we did this test and everything came out clear, so you're okay. And then I remember just agreeing, be like, okay, I guess if you say so, since you're the expert, and then you go home and then you realize that your body's telling you a different story and you don't really know how to have that conversation again with the same doctor that tells you that you're okay. And so it was a lot of just like denying my own lived experience because I place so much emphasis on whatever the doctor had to say was better than what I had to say. And so it wasn't until my pain got worse that it like pushed me to fight back, and to keep asking and keep bothering, keep going. And yeah, because I think if I gave in to what they had to say, I don't think I would have gotten a diagnosis. I think it would have led me straight to the ER, and I don't know if I'd still be here, to be honest. So yeah. I wanted to ask, does anybody know what a clinical diagnostic reasoning is? I'm just throwing questions because we're at a U of A medical humanities. So I figured there's probably med students somewhere in the room that wouldn't mind answering some questions of what that means, as simple as possible, as briefly as possible, which is a very big question, but I figured, you know what, let me ask this question. Yes. Okay, so what you said, so that everybody could hear, you said that it's like explaining your thought process as to how you get to a diagnosis. Okay, we could go to the next one. So yeah, so I just shared what Google said. Clinical reasoning is a complex cognitive process that is essential to evaluate and manage a patient's medical problem. It includes the diagnosis of the patient problem, making a therapeutic decision, and estimating the prognosis for the patient. The reason why I wanted to like just talk about or share this is because oftentimes, as a person with many lived experience and also having worked with family physicians, I often wonder, what do they need? What do they use to inform their decision on a diagnosis? And I think about the ways in which I communicate, and sometimes it won't fit, you know, the DSM or whatever book that is used to diagnose. And so I found myself oftentimes, especially as a person with rare diseases, to communicate with physicians or care providers, and I'm left with blank faces often when I tell them about my own experience. And it's almost as if they look within a particular like frame of thought that does not involve just the nuances of human experience. Does that make sense? It almost seems like it's just this box. And I feel like, I know we're talking about poetry, but overall in the arts, I think the power of art is that it allows human expression in many different mediums and forms. And I think poetry is a strong bridge, especially given that it is language, to merge into the ways in which care providers can create more empathy in how they view their patients' lived experience. Because oftentimes, especially when you're being seen often, or doctors see you or see a ton of patients, you know, it can feel very dehumanizing when the care provider does not even look at you in the eye, and they only focus on the blood results or your limbs to get the blood, and that's it. And so I just want to challenge, I guess, everyone in the room to consider engaging in poetry or even just art that deals with lived experience as a way to inform the ways in which you engage your care practice, but also in the ways that you support those around you who have lived experience. Because I think for me, that's what it allowed me, obviously, as a lived experience, but even to see how much people have resonated with what I've written, has motivated me to continue to do it. And it's also allowed me to speak up more, because oftentimes for me, it was very difficult to know how I felt until I wrote it. And to write and to say what I wrote out loud was an exercise in reclaiming my power. And I think that's the power of spoken word poetry in general. And so I guess I talked a little bit about poetry and advocacy. But when I think about the ways in which poetry could be integrated into a clinical care setting, I think of even in a waiting room, how there's so many different magazines, there's different resources that people sit there and wait until they are seen. And I think it would be really beautiful to have these resources around, or even in posters, where people are just sitting with their thoughts. I think these are ways in which poetry can feed people, and improve the human experience. I think that's the biggest thing. And it can give names to nameless things. And I think when it comes to rare diseases or just navigating symptoms and naming those, words have power, and to be able to identify what those words, to be able to name your feelings is a very powerful thing. And I think poetry does that in many ways. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, beyond the waiting room, I would say like the actual rooms that you're seeing your doctor in, because you're still having to wait. And it's usually just, posters about pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, I also think, I think it would be really great to incorporate like poetry even within like med school. I think engaging in that, because I think it's important for any care provider to engage in different frames of thought when it comes to lived experience, because I'm just one, but there are many, and the more that people have that breadth of knowledge, I think the more informed they will be in making space for human emotion during a clinical setting. I remember there was one instance where at that point, actually it was about 2 years ago, because of lupus, I ended up having to undergo low-dose chemotherapy to treat my kidneys 2 years ago during the pandemic. And when I was told that I needed chemotherapy, it's like as soon as you hear chemo, you think cancer, you think your brain kind of fogs up, and that's all you see. And I had an attending, I think it was, or somebody who was doing their fellowship in nephrology, as well as their supervisor in the room. And as this fellow was telling me this, it was very much like, this is the facts, this is what's happening. And then, they're laying out the pros and cons. And then the person that was supervising was kind enough to be like, she basically wanted to check in with me to see how much am I understanding of what's happening. So it gave me the space to just talk about what I'm absorbing from this conversation, because it was so overwhelming. But at the end, I was like, I'm scared. And then I started crying. And yeah, for obvious reasons, I was crying. And during that time, what was interesting was that the fellow, it was like the first time where she was like, oh, like it's almost like she kind of snapped out of this is what you do, like, and it like made the room a little bit more like, I found that she interacted with me in a more empathetic and gentle way, where I just wish that that was there from the jump and not, you know, I didn't need to cry in order for her to, especially when you're dealing with something as heavy as chemotherapy, a chemotherapy conversation. And I think like engaging in poetry that deals with concepts and tools like like subjects like this, I think, what I would hope would keep care providers more heart-centered as they build up their knowledge that they need to be more informed, obviously, in providing care. Is just not forget that you're dealing with humans, fragile humans, who need space, who need care and nurture in the midst of a very sterile environment that is medicine. Does that make sense? That's a good question. Thankfully, I'm like my flares and like have been relatively stable, and so I'm thankful that I'm at a, otherwise I probably would have not attended. And so that's definitely something that, especially as a person with an autoimmune condition in an ongoing pandemic, it's a very, it's every day is a fight, but we're here doing our best. And yeah, but it's not easy. And I know there's a lot of people that have greatly suffered throughout the pandemic, and still can't find the words. And there's a lot of my own experience in the past couple of years that I haven't found the words yet, but it's important to hold space for people so that they can find those words for themselves. I just wanted to ask you all, you know, fireside, what have you been taught to look for when hearing a patient's concerns, for those who are med students? And
for many things, I think they're very templated, where especially there's lots of acronyms or mnemonics that we have. For example, pain is a very common one where you ask about intensity, what is it?
Or location, duration.
Yeah, location, duration, provoking symptoms, things that make it better. So I think in hearing your reflections about trying to describe your pain, when for us, sometimes when we have this template that we're trying to take what you say and fit it into a template, is where that dissonance happens, because it's not going to fit into the template, and therefore then our cognitive model or our clinical reasoning has gaps. And I thought it was interesting when you're talking about that empathy of a healthcare provider providing to you as you're explaining these things. And I think being on the other side, the part that's difficult to traverse is, I think most healthcare providers are empathetic, and when we can't fill our clinical model, we feel like we are failing you. But it's when we have that uncertainty and we have nothing to offer, it's how do we navigate that, and how do we figure out how to piece together what you're telling us with the information that we have to this new model. And I think that's kind of why we're here this weekend, is to figure out that integration process and to bring those two things together and figure out how that can be more productive than both parties feeling like they're at a loss at the end of the interaction.
Yeah, I'd like to add something too, is like, I think one thing that is changing, especially in the medical like students and what we're being taught, is that they want us to like incorporate empathetic statements and like acknowledge and validate people's like emotions surrounding these kind of things. But what I found interesting is that a lot of the time it's tacked on the end. It's like an optional thing, whereas like I feel like that should be at the forefront of like asking like, how do you feel about this? Like, you want to stop and pause and like talk about it, like, and like acknowledge like this is like a heavy diagnosis and stuff like that. But at the end, like even just like when we get tested on these things, they're like, well, if you add these are nice. But it's like, well, that's not acknowledging the other human part of like the experience of you're getting like a huge life-changing thing brought onto you, and yeah, it just doesn't let time for that to happen.
Yeah, I also think when it comes to the overwhelming feeling that a patient experiences when it's like a lot of information, I think it doesn't have to all be in that visit. I think often of team-based care, you know, it's supposed to be the patient's family, you know, patient's medical home model within primary care. Like there's room for other care providers to support that patient after they have received all of this information. And I think there's opportunity there. And also, I was gonna say something to what you were saying, and then the thought just it left. But it might come back. Sorry, there's somebody in the chat. Okay, sorry, I'm just opening that. That's not bad. Sorry. I was gonna say something. Hold on. It was about just like the patient interaction. I think, yeah, there's ways. I think there's opportunity for. I think empathy is not just like, I hear you. I think it has to be in the way that people provide care, and because it's anybody who's experiencing life-changing changes when it comes to health will be going through or are starting to experience a level of grief, and if medicine or the way that care is practiced, if it was built in a way that could support patient in that way, I think we would go a long way. Any questions, comments?
Hi, it's Wendy. I was just curious what your experience has been trying to share any of your poetry with any of the health professionals that you've worked with.
Oh, that's a good question. I have not yet shared anything to my doctor. Yeah, I haven't. The only no, I haven't directly. That's kind of no. I wouldn't mind. It's not like I'm like opposed. But that's a good question.
It would be really eye-opening to share, especially your first poem. And I, as a physician, I certainly, and I'm in neurology, so a lot of the patients I see, there isn't much I can change for their life. And so I often describe that as walking in the gray zone, and you're really just walking hand in hand with someone as opposed to being able to make it better.
Thank you. I will try now. I'm like, maybe my next visit, I'll just give one poem.
Instead of them giving the prescription,
Be like, you over there. Exactly.
I was just thinking, I work in mental health and I also am a nurse. I was also just thinking about as physicians, like what is the intent when you walk in the room? Because I also think to give diagnosis or to give bad news or to talk about a treatment plan, because I also think that the intent matters and shifts the way that encounter unfolds, right? If the intent is to just disseminate the information, that doesn't need to be done face-to-face necessarily, right? There's other ways that it could be clear and could be interpreted in a patient's style to take that information. So if the intent is to be face-to-face with somebody in encounter, in relationship, in connection, then that has to lead the way you step into that encounter. And to me, that's not empathy tacked at the end, right? That's empathy leading the connection, the encounter, and the way that you're choosing to engage with someone. Because otherwise, you could do everything virtually or through a piece of paper or send a letter, or like we get our pap smear results in the mail, right? Like, I'm going to see that face, right? But when it's something like this, we need that connection, that human connection. And so I think that that is really, that to me is what needs to stay present.
I just mentioned that New Yorker essay, and it's called, oh no, A Doctor, a Patient, and Their Poetry, where the two share their poetry over the course of years. Wonderfully, I really recommend it.
The one comment I was actually, thank you, first of all, thank you for sharing. This added like so much. I was gonna just add, I remember the thought that I forgot now. It was around just like when it comes to patient interactions, especially when care providers don't really know an answer. As a person who have been in a lot of interactions where the doctors didn't know what to do, I always felt more heard when the care provider said, I don't know, but I'm gonna try and figure it out and get back to you, versus just, I don't know, and then that's it. And so knowing that someone is actually trying and to find the answer, and you're not left on with your own devices and trying to figure out, what to do. It always, to me, that showed empathy, that showed that like, you're not giving up on me because you don't know, because I think everybody understands that not everybody knows everything. I think patients are understandable in that sense, but it's when you're left by yourself is where the care just kind of drops off. And I think adding conversations like that really does help. And so that was my last thought. But thank you, everybody. It's been an honor to be here and to speak on these topics. Thank you.